The party at our son's new house was still in full swing. String lights glowing across the backyard, laughter drifting up from a crowd of maybe 60 people, when my wife Diane leaned close to my ear and whispered 5 words that ended our evening instantly. "We have to go. Now." I want to explain who Diane is before I tell you what she'd just seen, because her instincts are the entire reason our family is still whole today. My name is Richard Colton. Everyone calls me Rich. I'm 63 years old. Spent 30 years running a small commercial insurance agency before I retired. But the sharper mind in our marriage by far has always belonged to my wife. Diane spent 32 years as a senior claims investigator for one of the largest insurance carriers in the country. The last 18 of those years specializing exclusively in suspicious death and life insurance fraud cases. She has personally uncovered staged accidents, fake disappearances, and at least 4 cases over her career of what investigators in her field quietly call Black Widow fraud, a pattern where someone marries into money, quickly, deliberately, and ensures a payout follows not long after. I used to tease her early in our marriage that she couldn't sit through a movie without narrating exactly how the insurance investigator on screen was getting everything wrong. She'd point out mid-film that no legitimate claims adjuster would ever approve a payout that quickly, or that the burn pattern on a faked house fire in some thriller looked nothing like an actual accelerant trail. It became something of a family joke over the years, Diane's inability to fully turn off the part of her brain trained to notice when something didn't add up. Our son David used to roll his eyes about it as a teenager, the same way most kids roll their eyes at a parent's particular quirks. I don't think either of us ever imagined that exact instinct would someday be the only thing standing between him and the same fate as 2 men he'd never met. That night, we were celebrating our son David's housewarming party, 6 weeks after he and his new wife Amber moved into a stunning 5-bedroom house in one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. David is 32 years old, a talented structural engineer who'd spent a decade building a solid, modest life for himself before meeting Amber at a mutual friend's wedding just 8 months earlier. Their courtship had moved fast, faster than either Diane or I felt entirely comfortable with engaged after 10 weeks, married after 4 months, and now, remarkably, already settled into a house that, based on the neighborhood alone, had to be worth well over $2 million. David explained the house as mostly Amber's family helping out, a wedding gift from her side, something about a trust her late grandmother had left specifically for her eventual marriage. It sounded generous, if a little unusual, and David was so visibly happy, so completely wrapped up in this whirlwind new chapter of his life, that Diane and I had mostly kept our quiet reservations to ourselves. We'd raised him to make his own decisions. We tried, genuinely, to be supportive. I want to be honest about what those early months looked like from the outside, because I've spent a great deal of time since that party thinking about how easily we all talked ourselves out of noticing what was right in front of us. David had always been a careful, deliberate person, the kind of engineer who double-checks a load calculation 3 times before signing off on it. And watching him fall for Amber, with a speed that seemed almost out of character, worried Diane and me more than we ever fully admitted to each other, let alone to him. When we gently asked, early on, whether things felt like they were moving quickly, David would laugh it off warmly, telling us that when you know, that Amber made him feel more understood in 3 months than his last serious relationship had in 3 years. Amber herself was warm, attentive, endlessly complimentary toward David in a way that, looking back, functioned almost like a spotlight, drawing focus so consistently onto how wonderful and deserving David was that none of us thought to ask many questions about her own past at all. She described her family as small and scattered, her parents both gone, her only close relative, a devoted older brother named Curtis, who had, she explained, practically raised her after their mother passed when Amber was in her 20s. It was a sympathetic story, delivered with just enough quiet sadness to discourage anyone from probing further. And I remember feeling, at the time, a genuine wave of protective warmth toward her, the instinct to simply welcome someone who'd clearly had a difficult road into our family without making her relive it over dinner conversation. I understand now, with the clarity that only comes afterward, that this was likely by design, a story built specifically to close doors before anyone thought to knock on them. But Diane, that night, had gone upstairs during the party, and on her way back down, she passed the open door of the walk-in closet in the primary bedroom, where Amber had left several gift bags from earlier guests scattered on a bench, apparently intending to open them privately later. Diane, not one to snoop, told me she genuinely wasn't looking for anything, but her eye caught, almost involuntarily, on a small stack of folded monogrammed hand towels sitting on a shelf just inside that closet, tucked behind a row of Amber's designer handbags. The monogram on those towels read A&R, not A&D, for Amber and David. A&R beside the towels sat a man's wristwatch. Expensive. The kind of piece you'd find in a jewelry store display case rather than a department store, sitting in its original velvet box as though it had never actually been worn. Diane, curious now in a way she couldn't quite ignore, opened the box and turned it over. Engraved on the back in small, elegant script were the words, "To my loving husband Robert, forever yours, Amber." A date was engraved beneath it, 14 months earlier. Diane closed that box, walked calmly back downstairs, found me by the drink table, and whispered exactly what I told you a moment ago. We drove home in near silence that night. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter than the empty roads really called for, glancing over at Diane every few minutes, watching her stare out the passenger window with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she'd retired, the exact same focused, faraway look she used to wear at our own kitchen table decades earlier, poring over claim files late into the night on cases that troubled her enough to bring home. I knew better, after 35 years of marriage, than to push her to explain before she was ready. Diane processes things her own way, methodically, and interrupting that process before she'd finished walking through it herself had never once, in all our years together, sped anything up. Diane wouldn't fully explain what she'd found until we were safely inside our own kitchen, door locked, both of us still in our party clothes. Standing across from each other like two people bracing for bad news, neither of us was ready to hear. "Rich," she said. "Amber has been married before, recently, within the last 2 years, and not to anyone named David. I don't know what happened to that marriage, but I know from 32 years of doing this job that women don't accidentally leave a monogrammed, engraved wedding gift from a previous husband sitting in a closet unless something ended that relationship very suddenly, very recently, and probably not through a normal, amicable divorce." I asked her what she meant by not amicable. "I mean," Diane said carefully, "that in every single case I ever worked involving a pattern like this, a whirlwind marriage, a sudden windfall of money the new spouse can't fully explain, an engraved gift from a previous husband still sitting around unresolved. There was usually one of two explanations. Either there's an ongoing unresolved divorce that hasn't been finalized, which would make David's marriage to her legally void, or Robert, whoever he is, isn't around to ask for that watch back anymore. I didn't sleep that night. Either did Diane. By 6 the next morning, she was already at her laptop, and by 9, she'd called an old colleague from her insurance fraud days, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who still worked actively for the National Insurance Crime Bureau's Fraud Database Division, tracking exactly the kind of cross-jurisdictional patterns Diane suspected we might be looking at. Patricia called back that same afternoon, and what she found in just a few hours of searching turned my stomach in a way I still haven't fully recovered from. "Diane, I want you to sit down for this one," Patricia said when Diane put her on speakerphone at our kitchen table. I ran the name through our cross-jurisdictional marriage and property database, the one we built specifically to catch exactly this kind of pattern. And I got 3 separate hits that all trace back to the same woman using slightly different surname combinations each time. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't a simple case of someone remarrying after tragedy. The timeline is too tight, too consistent, and there's a common secondary name attached to all 3 that I want you to look at very carefully. Amber's legal name. According to public marriage and property records across 3 different states, was not simply Amber Wells the name David had married. It was Amber Renee Wells Hargrove Talbot, a name that had changed twice through marriage over the previous 6 years, each time under a slightly different first married surname combination that made a casual background check unlikely to connect the dots without specifically knowing what to search for. Her first documented marriage, 7 years earlier, was to a man named Gregory Hargrove, a mid-level software executive in Austin, Texas. That marriage ended after 14 months, not through divorce, but through Gregory's death ruled accidental, following a fall down a flight of stairs at their home. Amber, as his spouse, collected an $800,000 life insurance payout 6 weeks after the funeral. Her second marriage, 4 years later, was to Robert Talbot, an orthopedic surgeon in Denver, Colorado, the man whose engraved watch Diane had found sitting in that closet. That marriage lasted 16 months before Robert died in what was ruled a single-vehicle accident on an icy mountain road. Late at night, alone, in conditions the State Highway Patrol report described as unusually clear for the time of year. Amber collected $1.2 million from that policy, roughly 2 months after his death. The marriage to our son David had begun almost exactly 5 months after Robert Talbot's death. Rich, Diane said, her hands visibly shaking as she read through Patricia's findings spread across our kitchen table. David told us Amber inherited this house from a family trust. I don't think that's true. I think Amber has been systematically marrying men, insuring their lives for substantial amounts, and then arranging for those men to die in ways that look individually like tragic but explainable accidents. And I think our son may already be exactly where Robert Talbot and Gregory Hargrove were, right before it happened to them. We called our attorney first, a longtime family friend named Elaine Whitcomb, who immediately recommended we not confront David or Amber directly until we had law enforcement involved, given the severity and the potential danger of what we were suspecting. Elaine connected us within the same day to a detective in the department's financial crimes and cold case unit, a methodical, serious man named Detective Marcus Ferris, who had, it turned out, already flagged an unusual pattern in an unrelated cold case review involving Robert Talbot's death 18 months earlier, a case that had technically remained open due to some minor inconsistencies in the accident reconstruction that had never been fully resolved. Ferris met us at his office 2 days after Patricia's initial findings, a small cluttered room with case files stacked in neat, precise towers along one wall, and I remember being struck by how carefully he listened, taking notes in a small notebook rather than typing, asking Diane detailed, specific questions about exactly what she'd seen in that closet. The precise wording of the engraving, whether the towels looked new or worn, small details I hadn't even thought to consider significant until I watched him treat each one as a potential piece of evidence. "Mrs. Colton," he said, once she'd finished walking him through everything, "I want you to know that what you noticed in that closet is exactly the kind of detail most people, including, frankly, most investigators without your specific background, would have walked right past without a second thought. I've been sitting on an open file involving Robert Talbot's death for the better part of a year now, unable to justify reopening a formerly closed accidental death investigation on gut instinct alone. You may have just handed me the second data point I've needed this entire time, Mr. and Mrs. Colton," Detective Ferris told us during that first meeting. I want to be very careful about how we proceed here, because if your suspicions are correct, we're dealing with someone who has already successfully deceived law enforcement, insurance investigators, and two separate sets of grieving families across two different states. That takes patience and precision on her part, which means we need to match that patience with our own, or we risk tipping her off before we have enough to actually charge her with anything. Over the following 3 weeks, Detective Ferris's team quietly reopened the investigation into Robert Talbot's death, working alongside investigators in Colorado, while simultaneously beginning surveillance on Amber and, worryingly, on a man she introduced to our family as her older brother, Curtis, who had been present at nearly every major family gathering since the wedding, and who, Ferris's team discovered within days, was not actually related to Amber by blood at all. Curtis Whitfield had a documented informal financial connection to both of Amber's previous households, appearing in witness statements and neighbor interviews from both Gregory Hargrove's and Robert Talbot's deaths as a close family friend who happened to be present or nearby in the days surrounding each fatal accident. We believe Curtis functions as an accomplice, Ferris explained during our second meeting, 3 weeks into the investigation. In both prior cases, he appears to have had access to the victim's vehicle or immediate environment shortly before the fatal incident. We haven't yet connected him definitively to any physical evidence of tampering, largely because both prior deaths were initially ruled accidental and never received the forensic scrutiny a suspected homicide would have gotten. That's exactly what we're trying to correct now, quietly, before it happens a third time. The words, "before it happens a third time," landed on me like a physical blow. Somewhere in the 6 weeks since that housewarming party, while Diane and I had been carefully building this case alongside Detective Ferris, David had mentioned, almost in passing during a Sunday dinner, that Amber had encouraged him to increase his own life insurance policy now that we own a house together, suggesting a policy worth $3 million, significantly more than David, on a structural engineer's salary, would typically have considered necessary on his own. He'd already begun the application process. The policy's effective date, per the paperwork Diane later confirmed by quietly reviewing mail left on David's kitchen counter during a visit, was set to finalize in just under 2 weeks. We were, quite literally, racing a clock we didn't fully understand the shape of. Detective Ferris made the difficult decision, given the timeline, to bring David into the investigation directly, rather than waiting for more conclusive evidence. It was, he told us, an unusual step, but the alternative, allowing that insurance policy to finalize while Amber and Curtis potentially moved toward whatever their next step might be, was a risk none of us were willing to take. I will never forget the conversation we had with our son in Detective Ferris's office on a gray Wednesday afternoon. David sat across the table from us, confused and increasingly upset, as Ferris laid out, piece by piece, the pattern of 2 prior marriages, 2 suspicious deaths, and Curtis Whitfield's documented presence at both. David's first reaction was denial, sharp and immediate, the reaction of a man whose entire understanding of his own marriage was being dismantled in real time by his own parents and a police detective. "This doesn't make any sense," David said, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and fear. "Amber loves me. She talks about our future together constantly, our kids growing old in that house. You're telling me all of that is some kind of elaborate performance?" Diane reached across the table and took our son's hand. The same steady, gentle gesture she'd used with him as a small boy every time he'd scraped a knee or lost a school competition. "David, I've spent 32 years studying exactly this kind of performance," she said quietly. "The most convincing ones are always built on real affection, or at least something that looks and feels like it from the inside. That's what makes them work. I'm not asking you to believe Amber has never felt anything for you at all. I'm asking you to look at 2 dead husbands, an insurance policy timeline that matches almost exactly, and a man pretending to be her brother who was standing near both of those deaths. And ask yourself honestly whether you're willing to bet your life that this time is somehow different. David sat in silence for a long time. Then he asked Detective Ferris the one question that, I think, finally made everything real for him. He asked to see photographs of Gregory Hargrove and Robert Talbot. Ferris slid 2 photographs across the table. Ordinary men, smiling in what looked like engagement or wedding photos. Men who, months after those pictures were taken, had died in accidents that, individually, no one had ever questioned. David stared at those photographs for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, the last thin thread of denial finally giving way. They look happy, David said quietly, almost to himself. In these pictures, I mean. They look exactly as happy as I felt 6 months ago. He set the photographs down carefully, like they might break, and looked up at Ferris. Tell me what you actually know for certain, not what you suspect. I need to hear the difference clearly before I decide what I believe. Ferris walked him through it methodically. The same careful, evidence-first approach I imagine he'd use in front of a jury, laying out only what had been independently verified. The timeline of the 2 prior deaths, the insurance payouts, Curtis's documented presence near both incidents, and the still open question marks in both original accident reconstructions that had never been fully resolved. He was honest with David that they did not yet have definitive proof of foul play in either death, only a pattern troubling enough to justify reopening both cases and taking the threat to David's own safety with the utmost seriousness in the meantime. What do you need me to do? David finally asked, his voice steadier than I expected, the engineer in him, I think, instinctively reaching for the practical next step, rather than sitting any longer in the emotional wreckage of what he'd just learned. I need you to keep living your life exactly as normal as you can manage, Ferris told him. Go to work, come home. Let Amber and Curtis believe nothing has changed. It's the hardest thing I'm going to ask of you in this entire process, and I won't pretend otherwise. But it's also the only way we build a case strong enough to guarantee this ends here, with both of them held fully accountable, rather than simply scaring them into disappearing and starting this exact same pattern somewhere else with someone else's son. What followed was 6 of the most difficult weeks of our family's life. David, coached carefully by Detective Ferris's team, continued living at home with Amber, behaving as normally as he could manage, while investigators built out the remaining pieces of the case. Diane and I saw him almost every day during those weeks, ostensibly for ordinary family visits. Though every conversation carried an unspoken weight, none of us fully knew how to navigate. I watched my son sit across from Amber at Sunday dinner, laughing at her jokes, complimenting her cooking, performing an ordinary marriage with a composure that frankly frightened me, and I understood, watching him, exactly how much strength it was taking him to hold that performance together while carrying what he now knew underneath it. Ferris's team obtained a warrant to more thoroughly examine David's vehicle, discovering during a routine maintenance check disguised as a scheduled service appointment early signs of tampering with the brake line, a partial cut, professionally done, calibrated to fail gradually rather than immediately, the kind of slow, deniable failure that would likely present as a mechanical fault rather than obvious sabotage, particularly on the winding mountain road David regularly used for his commute. The mechanic who discovered it, working undercover as part of the investigation, told Ferris afterward that whoever had done the work clearly had real technical skill, precise, deliberate cuts positioned exactly where a standard visual inspection would be least likely to catch them. Diane, when Ferris shared that detail with us, went very quiet for a long moment before saying something I have thought about often since. That's not the work of someone panicking, she said. That's the work of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how to make it look like nothing at all. That discovery changed everything about the pace of the investigation. Ferris moved quickly to install covert surveillance inside David and Amber's home. With David's full cooperation, and within 9 days, investigators captured a conversation between Amber and Curtis in the garage, believing themselves unmonitored, discussing the timing of David's upcoming policy finalization and confirming explicitly that the brake work needed to be finished properly this time. Not like the mess with Robert's car, where the inspector almost caught it. That single sentence, not like the mess with Robert's car, gave Ferris's team everything they needed to formally reopen Robert Talbot's death as an active homicide investigation, and to move forward with arrest warrants for both Amber and Curtis on charges connected to the attempted tampering of David's vehicle. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before David's life insurance policy was set to finalize. Detective Ferris's team, working alongside David under careful, controlled circumstances, arranged for David to leave for what Amber believed was simply his normal morning commute, while officers waited nearby, having already confirmed through the covert surveillance that Curtis had, the previous night, made a final visit to the garage. I was not present for the arrest itself, but Detective Ferris walked us through it afterward in careful detail, understanding, I think, how badly we needed to hear exactly how it had gone. David left the house at his usual time, drove 3 blocks to a designated meeting point where officers were waiting, and was immediately taken into protective custody while a separate team moved on the house. Amber, according to Ferris, answered the door still in her robe, coffee in hand, and the composure Diane had described from that party 6 weeks earlier held for almost a full 10 seconds after officers announced themselves before it finally completely collapsed. Curtis was arrested less than a mile away, pulled over during what officers determined was an attempt to leave the area entirely, his vehicle containing a partially assembled toolkit consistent with the brake line tampering already discovered on David's car, along with a duffel bag packed with enough clothing and cash to suggest he had, at minimum, been prepared to disappear on short notice. Both were charged initially with attempted murder and conspiracy, charges that expanded significantly over the following months as investigators in Colorado and Texas reopened the deaths of Robert Talbot and Gregory Hargrove, ultimately upgrading both cases to homicide once forensic re-examination, informed by the pattern Ferris's team had uncovered, revealed similar early-stage tampering evidence that had gone unnoticed during the original, far less scrutinized investigations. David's marriage to Amber was annulled within weeks on the grounds of fraud, once it became clear that her prior marriage to Robert Talbot had never been formally, legally dissolved before her marriage to David, meaning that in the strictest legal sense, she had never actually been free to marry our son at all. The house, it turned out, had been purchased not through any family trust, but through the life insurance proceeds from Robert Talbot's death, funneled through a series of accounts Curtis had helped structure to obscure the original source of funds, a detail that ultimately added additional financial fraud charges to the case against both of them. David has spent the better part of the last year rebuilding, slowly, the same way any of us rebuild, after discovering the foundation we thought we were standing on was never solid to begin with. He moved back in with us for the first 4 months after the arrest, unable to bring himself to sleep in that house even once it was legally his own, unwilling to stay somewhere every room of which now felt, to him, like evidence in a case rather than a home. Some nights during those 4 months, I'd come downstairs late and find him sitting alone in the kitchen, not doing anything in particular, just sitting, and I'd sit with him without saying much of anything, because I quickly learned there wasn't much I could actually say that would help beyond simply being there. He eventually sold the property. Once the estate and insurance fraud proceedings resolved enough to allow it, and used the proceeds, after significant legal complications, given the fraudulent origins of the purchase, to buy a small, unremarkable townhouse across town, the kind of modest, honest place he told me he actually wanted from the very beginning. before a whirlwind romance convinced him he needed something grander to prove how far he'd come. He picked out the furniture himself this time, slowly, piece by piece over several months. And I remember him telling me, half joking, that he'd started reading customer reviews for everything twice before buying it, that he supposed he'd developed a permanent, healthy suspicion of things that seemed too easy. Amber and Curtis are both currently awaiting trial, facing charges in 3 separate states. Prosecutors in Colorado and Texas working in close coordination with Detective Ferris's office here, building what one assistant district attorney described to us as one of the most methodically documented serial homicide for insurance cases this office has, handled in over a decade, given the strength of the surveillance recordings and the forensic tampering evidence recovered from David's vehicle. Prosecutors are confident in securing convictions on all 3 cases, though the trial process, given its scope, is expected to take well over a year to fully resolve. We've since learned through the ongoing investigation that Robert Talbot's and Gregory Hargrove's families had never met each other, had no idea the other existed, until Ferris's team connected the 2 cases through Amber's pattern. Diane spoke with Robert's sister once, briefly by phone, both of them in their own way, finally getting a small piece of the closure 2 entirely separate families had been denied for years. David still struggles, understandably, with a particular kind of grief that doesn't get talked about very often. The grief of loving someone who, it turns out, was never entirely real, at least not in the way he believed. Diane and I have spent countless evenings this past year simply sitting with him through it. The same steady, patient presence we tried to offer him through every hard season of his life. Because there is no faster way through this particular kind of pain than simply having people willing to sit beside you in it. He started seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma recovery for survivors of relationship fraud, a specialty I hadn't even known existed until this past year, and he tells us it's helping slowly, the way most real healing tends to, I think most nights, about that walk-in closet, about a stack of monogrammed towels and a watch in a velvet box that Diane very easily could have walked right past without a second glance, the way most people probably would have. I think about how close our son came to becoming the 3rd name on a list none of us knew existed until the night his mother happened to need the upstairs bathroom at his own housewarming party. Diane says, when people ask her how she noticed something so small in the middle of a crowded party, that 32 years of studying fraud teaches you to trust the detail that doesn't quite fit, even when everything around it looks perfectly ordinary. I think it's simpler than that, honestly. I think it's love, the particular watchful kind that never fully turns off, even at a party full of laughter and string lights, even when everyone around you insists everything is fine. Never underestimate the power of a small detail that doesn't quite add up. Sometimes the person who notices it isn't being paranoid or overprotective. Sometimes they're the only reason the people they love are still here to tell the story afterward. Has your instinct ever picked up on something small that turned out to save someone you love? Tell me your story in the comments below. And if this one kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like and subscribe for more true story narrations every week.